I was preparing lunch in my kitchen when my phone rang. Susanna, my 25 relatives are coming for Christmas dinner. You'll handle everything as usual. The line went dead before I could respond. 5 years I had devoted to making this woman feel welcome in my home. 5 years of cooking, cleaning, and being treated like hired help. I set down the watering can and took a deep breath. Then I smiled. I walked inside and pulled out my address book. But there was something Marlene didn't know. Something I had discovered just last week while organizing old papers. I dialed my lawyer's number and scheduled an appointment for the next morning. At that moment, I made a decision. This Christmas would be different. My name is Susanna, and I was about to remind everyone whose house this really was. That lawyer's appointment wasn't scheduled randomly. 3 weeks earlier, while organizing papers in my late husband's study, I had found something that changed everything. Hidden behind his framed engineering diploma were documents I never knew existed. Investment certificates worth over $400,000. Properties in my name I had forgotten about. Bank statements showing steady rental income that had been automatically deposited into an account I rarely checked. For decades, Robert had quietly built our financial security while I focused on raising Renato and managing our household. I remember the exact moment when Marlene's true nature first revealed itself. It was Renato's birthday 3 years ago. I had spent 2 days preparing his favorite meal, lamb with rosemary, just like his father used to make. The dining room table was set with our wedding china, candles lit, everything perfect. When the family arrived, Marlene walked straight to the kitchen, picked up the serving platter, and announced to everyone, "Look what we prepared for Renato. I hope you all enjoy our dinner." She didn't even glance at me standing there with flour still under my fingernails. That night, I cleaned every dish while she sat in the living room accepting compliments for my cooking. Renato just smiled and nodded, never once correcting her. The second memory that haunts me happened last Christmas morning. I had been wrapping gifts since November, carefully selecting something special for each family member. Marlene's sister, Carmen, was opening the cashmere scarf I had chosen specifically to match her blue eyes when Marlene interrupted. "Susanna, we need more coffee in the kitchen." "Not please. Not when you have a moment. Just a command," spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. I was 53 years old and being dismissed like hired help in my own living room. When I returned with the coffee pot, Carmen was thanking Marlene for the beautiful scarf. "Oh, you're so thoughtful," she said, squeezing Marlene's hand. Marlene just smiled and accepted the praise that belonged to me. Over 5 years, I calculated that I had cooked approximately 1,800 meals for family gatherings. 1,800 times I planned menus, shopped for groceries, prepared food, and served others while Marlene took credit. I had hosted 42 birthday parties, 15 holiday celebrations, 8 anniversary dinners, and countless Sunday family meals. Each time, I was the one washing dishes at midnight while everyone else relaxed. Each time, Marlene positioned herself as the gracious hostess while treating me like invisible kitchen staff. The numbers don't lie. In those 5 years, I had spent over $15,000 of my own money on groceries for family gatherings that Marlene organized without consulting me about the budget. She would invite people, promise elaborate meals, then expect me to fund and prepare everything. When Renato's cousin asked last Easter how we managed such wonderful entertaining, Marlene actually said, "Well, you know how it is. Good hosting requires such careful planning and attention to detail." She said this while I was literally serving the dessert I had baked from scratch the night before. This pattern had become so normalized that even I started to doubt my own memories. When I tried to bring up my feelings to Renato, he would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Mom, you're being too sensitive. Marlene appreciates everything you do." But appreciation was never the word I would have chosen. Exploitation felt more accurate. Every family gathering followed the same script. Marlin would make grand announcements about hosting. I would do all the actual work. She would receive all the social credit, and I would clean up the aftermath alone. What bothered me most wasn't just the lack of recognition. It was the deliberate erasure of my contributions. When Marlin's mother visited last spring, she spent the entire weekend praising Marlin's homemaking skills. "Your house is always so beautiful and well organized," she gushed. "You've created such a warm family atmosphere." I was standing right there, arranging fresh flowers in a vase, having just finished 3 hours of cleaning to prepare for her visit. Neither Marlene nor her mother acknowledged my presence. I might as well have been a ghost haunting my own home. The morning after that phone call about the 25 relatives, I sat in my kitchen reviewing those hidden financial documents. My hands were steady as I spread the papers across the table where I had served so many meals to ungrateful people. The rental income statements showed consistent monthly deposits of $3,200 for the past 8 years. The investment certificates had grown substantially since Robert's passing. The property deeds revealed that I owned not just our family home, but also the duplex on Maple Street where young families lived, and a small commercial building downtown that housed 3 successful businesses. For the first time in 5 years, I felt powerful instead of powerless. Marlene had no idea that her entire dynamic with me was built on a false premise. She treated me like a dependent woman with no resources, no options, no leverage. The truth was exactly the opposite. I had more financial independence than my son and his wife combined. I had been subsidizing their lifestyle while they diminished my dignity. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me strategic. I started documenting everything with new eyes. When Marlene called that afternoon to clarify Christmas dinner details, I recorded the conversation on my phone. "Susanna, my cousin Elena is bringing her 3 children, so we'll need extra high chairs. And please make sure you have enough ham. You know how my family eats." She spoke to me like I was her personal assistant, not the woman whose home she was commandeering for her family reunion. The recording captured every dismissive word, every assumption about my availability, every expectation that I would silently comply. That evening, when Renato came home from work, I was sitting in the living room with my findings spread across the coffee table. Bank statements, rental agreements, investment certificates, property deeds. He walked in, expecting to find his mother upset and defeated by his wife's demands. Instead, he found a woman with a calculator, a legal pad, and a surprisingly calm expression. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, loosening his tie. I looked up from my calculations and smiled. "Son, I'm learning exactly how much power I actually have." It's quite educational. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Renato had never considered that his mother might have independent resources or autonomous decision-making capabilities. In his mind, just like in Marlene's, I existed to serve their needs without question. My happiness was optional, but my compliance was expected. That assumption had worked for 5 years because I had allowed it to work. But assumptions, I was discovering, can be quite fragile when examined closely. I explained calmly that I would not be hosting Christmas dinner for 25 people I had never met. More importantly, I would not be present to watch Marlene take credit for work she hadn't done, cooking she hadn't prepared, or hospitality she hadn't provided. "But Mom," Renato protested, "these are important family connections for Marlene. Her relatives are expecting a traditional celebration." I set down my pen and looked directly at him. "Son, your wife can provide a traditional celebration. I'll be traveling." The word traveling seemed to confuse him completely. Traveling where? "You never travel alone." And what will people think if you're not here for Christmas? His questions revealed how thoroughly he had internalized his wife's view of me as a fixed domestic resource rather than an autonomous human being. I didn't answer his questions because the answers weren't his business. For the first time in years, my plans belonged to me alone. What I had discovered in those documents wasn't just financial security. It was evidence of a completely different story than the one I had been telling myself. I wasn't a widow dependent on her son's family for purpose and belonging. I was an independent woman who had been choosing to share her resources and energy with people who took them for granted. Choice, I realized, was the key word I had been missing. Everything I had been doing was actually voluntary, which meant I could stop volunteering anytime I decided to. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Patricia Wells, and scheduled that appointment I had mentioned to Marlene. Patricia had handled Robert's estate years ago, but we had remained friendly over the years. When I explained my situation, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed my entire perspective. Susanna, what you're describing isn't family dynamics. It's economic exploitation with emotional manipulation, and you have significantly more leverage than you realize. Patricia asked me to bring all the financial documents to our meeting, along with any recordings or written communications I had with Marlene. She also requested details about any money I had spent on family gatherings, any household expenses I had covered, and any gifts or loans I had provided to Renato and Marlene over the years. We need to establish a clear record, she explained, of who has been supporting whom in this relationship. That conversation was the moment I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started recognizing myself as someone who had been making poor business decisions with her emotional investments. Marlene wasn't just disrespectful. She was financially dependent on my contributions while simultaneously undermining my dignity. Renato wasn't just passive. He was complicit in a system that benefited him at my expense. These weren't personality conflicts. They were economic relationships that needed restructuring. I spent the weekend before my lawyer meeting conducting a thorough audit of my household expenses. The numbers were staggering. Over the past year alone, I had spent over $8,000 on groceries for family gatherings. I had paid for 3 appliance repairs that benefited everyone living in the house. I had covered the cost of landscaping, house cleaning, and home improvements that increased the property value. Meanwhile, Renato and Marlene contributed their portion of the mortgage and utilities, but treated everything else as my responsibility. The morning of my appointment with Patricia, I dressed carefully in my navy suit and pearl earrings. I wanted to look like the financially independent woman I was, not the domestic servant I had been pretending to be. In my briefcase, I carried every document that proved my actual economic position, every recording that demonstrated Marlene's exploitative behavior, and every receipt that showed my uncompensated contributions to their household. Patricia's office was downtown in a building overlooking the harbor. Sitting across from her mahogany desk, I felt like I was reclaiming a professional identity I had forgotten I possessed. For 40 years, I had managed household budgets, coordinated complex family logistics, negotiated with contractors, and maintained property investments. Those were business skills, not just domestic duties. Marlene had convinced me that my capabilities were ordinary and unremarkable, but Patricia saw them differently. Susanna, she said after reviewing my documents, you've been running a family operation that generates significant value for everyone except yourself. The rental income alone puts you in a stronger financial position than most people your age. The property assets give you options most women in your situation don't have. And the receipts you've shown me indicate that you've been subsidizing a lifestyle your son and daughter-in-law couldn't afford without your contributions. Her assessment was both validating and sobering. I had more power than I realized, but I had been wielding it against my own interests. Patricia outlined 4 specific steps we needed to take immediately to protect my assets and reestablish appropriate boundaries. First, we would revise my will and establish a trust that prevented anyone from claiming inheritance rights to my property during my lifetime. Second, we would document my rental income and investment returns to establish my independent financial status. Third, we would create a formal household agreement that outlined everyone's responsibilities and contributions. Fourth, we would serve notice to Marlene and Renato that their residence in my home was conditional on their respect for my autonomy and their proportional contribution to household expenses. The legal terminology was complex, but the underlying concept was simple. My house, my rules, my decisions. For too long, I had allowed other people to treat my generosity as their entitlement. Patricia was going to help me convert my voluntary contributions into conscious choices with clearly defined terms and conditions. That afternoon, I stopped at the bank and opened a separate checking account for household expenses. From now on, if Marlene wanted to host family gatherings, she would need to transfer money into that account to cover the actual costs. No more assumptions about my willingness to fund her social ambitions. No more expectation that I would provide free labor for events that enhanced her reputation. I also called a real estate appraiser to assess the current value of all my properties. The numbers were higher than I expected. The family home was worth nearly $600,000. The duplex had appreciated to $320,000, and the commercial building was valued at $280,000. Combined with my investment portfolio and savings accounts, my net worth exceeded $1.3 million. I was not a woman who needed to tolerate disrespect in order to maintain financial security. When I arrived home that evening, Marlene was in the kitchen making a list of Christmas menu items. She looked up as I walked in and said, "Oh, good, you're here. I've been planning the holiday meals, and I need to know what serving dishes we have for 25 people." The casual assumption that I would automatically participate in her planning was exactly the behavior Patricia had identified as problematic. Instead of answering her question, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen island. "Marlene," I said calmly, "I won't be here for Christmas. You'll need to handle the meal planning yourself." She stopped writing and stared at me. "What do you mean you won't be here? Where could you possibly be going?" Her tone suggested that my potential destinations were both limited and irrelevant. I sipped my wine and smiled. "I'm taking a vacation." Patricia helped me book a very nice suite at the Grand Pacific Hotel. Ocean view, room service, spa amenities. It should be quite relaxing. The expression on Marlene's face shifted from confusion to irritation to something approaching panic. "But, Susanna, my family is expecting a traditional Christmas dinner. Elena's children have special dietary restrictions. Uncle Carlos specifically requested your famous apple pie. You can't just abandon your responsibilities." Her language revealed everything wrong with our relationship. My cooking had become her promises. My labor had become her obligations. My home had become her venue for entertaining. I finished my wine and stood up slowly. "Marlene, your family will still have Christmas dinner. You'll just be the one preparing it instead of taking credit for it." Then, I walked upstairs to start packing for the most liberating vacation of my life. The next morning, Renato confronted me before leaving for work. "Mom, Marlene is really upset about your travel plans. She's been crying all night. Can't you postpone your trip until after New Year's?" His approach was predictably focused on managing his wife's emotions rather than examining the legitimacy of her expectations. I was folding sweaters into my suitcase when he knocked on my bedroom door. "Come in, son," I said without looking up. He sat on the edge of my bed and used the tone he might employ with a rebellious teenager. "This isn't like you, Mom. You've always put family first. Marlon's relatives are going to think we don't care about hospitality. I stopped packing and turned to face him completely. Renato, when exactly did my unpaid labor become the foundation of your wife's reputation? The question hung in the air between us. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I want you to think about something, I continued. For 5 years, I have cooked, cleaned, organized, and hosted for Marlon's benefit. She has taken credit for my work, spent my money, and treated me like hired help in my own home. You have watched this happen and said nothing. Now, when I finally choose to prioritize my own well-being, you're asking me to reconsider because it might inconvenience your wife. Do you understand how that sounds? Renato shifted uncomfortably. But, Mom, marriage is about compromise. Families have to work together. His words would have been more convincing if the compromise hadn't been entirely one-sided, and if the family cooperation hadn't consisted mainly of my uncompensated contributions to their comfort. I resumed packing while I spoke. You're absolutely right about families working together. That's why Marlene will have the opportunity to demonstrate her own family commitment by cooking Christmas dinner herself. That afternoon, I implemented the first phase of my strategic withdrawal. I emptied the pantry of all specialty ingredients, packing the expensive spices, imported olive oil, and premium baking supplies into boxes that went directly into my car. If Marlene wanted to host 25 people for Christmas dinner, she would need to purchase her own groceries with her own money. I left basic staples like salt, pepper, and flour, but everything that would contribute to an impressive holiday meal came with me to the hotel. I also removed all the good serving pieces, Christmas china, silver candlesticks, and linen tablecloths from the dining room cabinets. These items belonged to me, had been gifts from my wedding or purchases I had made over the years. Marlene had used them freely for 5 years, but she had never owned them. If she wanted to create an elegant table setting for her family gathering, she would need to acquire her own hosting supplies. From the living room, I packed the good champagne glasses, the crystal decanters, and the silver serving trays that had made previous gatherings seem so effortlessly sophisticated. Marlene had developed a reputation as an elegant hostess, using my belongings to create ambiance she couldn't have achieved with her own resources. Christmas would be an excellent opportunity for her to discover what her entertaining skills looked like without my subsidization. I left a note on the kitchen counter explaining my actions in neutral, factual language. Marlene and Renato, I will be staying at the Grand Pacific Hotel from December 20th through January 2nd. The specialty ingredients and serving pieces I have removed belong to me personally and will be returned when I move back in. The household cleaning service has been canceled for the holiday period. The grocery account at Morrison's Market has been closed. All Christmas hosting expenses will need to be covered by your own funds. I hope you have a meaningful celebration with your 25 relatives. Patricia Wells, my attorney, can be reached at 5550147 if you need to discuss any legal or financial matters during my absence. The note was deliberately businesslike because this was, fundamentally, a business transaction. For 5 years, I had been providing goods and services without appropriate compensation or recognition. Now I was terminating that arrangement and returning to standard market principles. If Marlene wanted holiday hosting services, she was free to hire professional caterers, rent equipment, and purchase ingredients. Those were the terms available to anyone else who wanted to entertain 25 people for Christmas dinner. I checked into the Grand Pacific Hotel on December 20th with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. The suite Patricia had helped me book was on the 8th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The living room had a comfortable sofa, a writing desk, and a small dining table where I could enjoy room service meals. The bedroom had a king-size bed with luxury linens and a marble bathroom with a deep soaking tub. For the first time in 5 years, I was in a space where every decision was mine alone. The hotel staff treated me with exactly the kind of respect I had stopped receiving at home. When I arrived, the desk clerk smiled warmly and said, "Welcome to the Grand Pacific, Mrs. Rivera. We're so pleased to have you staying with us. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your visit more comfortable." It was a small interaction, but it reminded me how normal courtesy was supposed to feel. From my suite, I could see the marina where decorated boats created a festive holiday display. Couples walked along the waterfront, bundled in winter coats, and families gathered on restaurant patios with space heaters and hot chocolate. It was a completely different kind of Christmas scene from the domestic chaos I had been orchestrating for years. Here, I was a guest being served instead of a servant managing everyone else's comfort. That evening, I ordered dinner from room service and ate by the window while watching the sunset over the water. The salmon was perfectly prepared, the wine was excellent, and I didn't have to plan anyone else's meal, serve anyone else's food, or clean up after anyone else's celebration. The silence was luxurious. No one needed anything from me, and I needed nothing from anyone else. My phone began ringing around 8 o'clock. The details Patricia shared were both shocking and clarifying. Over the past 2 years, Marlene had applied for credit cards using my social security number and home address. She had taken cash advances totaling over $12,000, money that had gone toward her personal shopping and entertainment expenses. She had also attempted to use my property as collateral for a business loan. She wanted to start an online boutique. "How did you discover this?" I asked, suddenly feeling less relaxed despite my spa treatment the day before. Patricia explained that she had requested credit reports as part of her standard review process when establishing my trust. The unauthorized accounts showed up immediately. "Susanna, this isn't just family drama. This is identity theft and fraud. We need to take immediate legal action to protect your credit and recover the stolen funds." First Renato, then Marlene, then Renato again. I could see their names on the display, but I didn't answer. Whatever crisis was developing at home was no longer my crisis to resolve. They had made it clear that my role was to provide solutions while they received credit. Now they could experience the full scope of the problems they had been delegating to me for 5 years. The calls continued throughout the evening, eventually joined by voicemails I chose not to listen to. My phone kept buzzing with text messages that I scrolled past without reading. After 40 years of being constantly available to manage other people's needs, I was learning the profound peace of being temporarily unreachable. The world, it turned out, could function without my immediate intervention. On December 22nd, I decided to conduct a little experiment. I called my neighbor Margaret, who had a clear view of my house from her kitchen window. "Margaret, this is Susanna. I'm wondering if you could tell me what kind of activity you've noticed at my house over the past couple of days." Margaret was delighted to share her observations. "Oh, honey, it's been quite dramatic over there. Yesterday, I saw Marlene loading boxes and boxes of groceries from her car. Must have taken 6 trips. And this morning, there was a delivery truck from some rental company bringing tables and chairs. Looked like they were setting up for quite a party. But I have to say, Marlene looked pretty stressed. She was on the phone most of the afternoon, and I could hear her voice getting louder and louder." Margaret's report confirmed what I had expected. Marlene was discovering exactly how much work and expense was involved in hosting 25 people for Christmas dinner when she couldn't delegate the responsibilities to someone else. The rental furniture suggested she didn't have adequate seating in the house, which meant she had never actually calculated what would be required for her ambitious guest list. "Oh, and Susanna," Margaret continued, "I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but several cars have been driving by slowly looking at your house. They seem confused, like they're not sure they have the right address. One car even parked and the driver walked up to your front door, but then left without knocking. This detail was particularly satisfying. Marlene's relatives were probably expecting to arrive at the kind of elegant, well-appointed home that I had been helping her maintain for years. Instead, they would find a house that reflected her actual homemaking capabilities, without my invisible support. The disconnect between their expectations and the reality would be educational for everyone involved. That afternoon, I treated myself to the hotel spa. A massage, facial, and manicure seemed like appropriate uses of my time, while Marlene was presumably preparing tomorrow's feast for 25 people. The spa attendants were professional and attentive, creating exactly the kind of pampering experience I had been providing for others without ever receiving for myself. During my massage, I reflected on how differently my body felt when I wasn't carrying the physical stress of managing everyone else's needs. My shoulders weren't tense from hours of cooking and cleaning. My hands weren't rough from constant dishwashing. My back wasn't aching from bending over to serve people who couldn't be bothered to say thank you. Relaxation, I realized, was easier when I wasn't simultaneously planning someone else's comfort. Christmas Eve morning brought a new development. Patricia called my hotel room with information that changed the entire dynamic of my situation. "Susanna, I think you need to hear this. I've been doing some background research on your daughter-in-law, and I discovered some troubling financial information. Marlene has been using your name and credit to obtain loans you never authorized. Sometimes we need to reclaim our own worth, and it's never too late to start." And that's how my story unfolded, from being treated like hired help to becoming the respected woman I always deserved to be. If you enjoyed hearing about my journey, please subscribe. I have many more stories to share. My first reaction was anger, but it quickly transformed into something more strategic. Marlene had just provided me with legal leverage that went far beyond family dynamics. If she had been stealing my financial identity, then every argument about family loyalty and holiday traditions became irrelevant. This was criminal behavior that required legal consequences, not family therapy. Patricia advised me to return to the house immediately, not to resume my domestic duties, but to formally confront Marlene with evidence of her crimes in front of her 25 relatives. "Susanna, this situation is beyond personal boundaries now. She's committed felony fraud using your identity. The family gathering today provides an opportunity to address this publicly and establish witnesses to her response." I checked out of the hotel with mixed feelings. My peaceful retreat was ending, but I was returning home with significantly more power than when I had left. Instead of being the woman who ran away from family obligations, I was now the victim of financial crimes who was coming home to press charges against her daughter-in-law. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, the scene was exactly what I had expected. Cars lined both sides of the street, children were running around the front yard, and the sound of loud conversations spilled out from the open front door. Marlene had managed to assemble her 25 relatives for Christmas dinner, but the execution was clearly not meeting her usual standards. I walked through my own front door, carrying the box of serving pieces I had removed days earlier. The living room was crowded with people I didn't recognize, sitting on mismatched rental chairs and eating from paper plates. The elegant ambiance that had characterized previous family gatherings was conspicuously absent. This looked like a church basement potluck, rather than the sophisticated Christmas celebration Marlene had promised her relatives. In the kitchen, I found chaos that confirmed everything I had suspected about Marlene's actual hosting capabilities. Dirty pots were piled in the sink, food was burning on the stove, and the counters were cluttered with opened packages and spilled ingredients. Marlene was standing at the stove looking harried and overwhelmed, wearing an apron that was already stained with grease and flour. She looked up as I entered, and her expression shifted rapidly through relief, anger, and something approaching panic. "Susanna, Thank God you're back. Everything is going wrong. The turkey is taking forever to cook, the potatoes are lumpy, and I can't figure out how to make gravy. Can you please help me fix this before everyone realizes what a disaster this is? Her request revealed the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized our relationship for 5 years. When things went smoothly, she took credit for my work. When things went poorly, she expected me to rescue her reputation. The performance was over, and the audience was about to discover who had actually been running the show. "Marlene," I said calmly, "before we discuss dinner, I need to talk to you about the credit cards you opened using my social security number." The color drained from her face immediately. She glanced toward the living room where her relatives were chatting and laughing, then back at me with an expression that confirmed her guilt more effectively than any confession could have. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. "We can discuss this later. Right now, I need help with Christmas dinner." She was still trying to manage the crisis by deflecting attention to immediate practical needs, but I was no longer available to be redirected by her priorities. "Actually, Marlon, we're going to discuss this right now, in front of your family." I walked past her into the living room, where 25 people were balancing paper plates on their knees and making the best of an obviously disappointing meal. The conversation quieted as I appeared, and I realized that most of them had never seen me before, despite having eaten food I had prepared at previous gatherings. "Excuse me, everyone," I said in a voice that carried clearly through the room. "I'm Susana Rivera, and this is my house." I believe most of you know Marlene, but you may not realize that she has been taking credit for hospitality and cooking that I have been providing for the past 5 years. The silence that followed was profound. People stopped eating and looked between Marlene and me with expressions of confusion and growing awareness. Today's meal represents Marlene's actual hosting capabilities without my contributions. I hope you're enjoying the experience of her authentic cooking and entertaining skills. The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Several of Marlene's relatives glanced at their paper plates and burned food with new understanding. Marlene appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, her face red with embarrassment and anger. "Susanna, this is completely inappropriate. These are my family members, and you're ruining Christmas." Her protest only confirmed what I had just revealed. She was more concerned about her reputation than about addressing the financial crimes she had committed. "Marlene is correct that this is her family gathering," I continued, "which makes it an appropriate venue to discuss why she has been using my identity to obtain credit cards and cash advances totaling over $12,000. The room became completely silent. Someone set down their fork. A child stopped crying. The only sound was the smoke alarm in the kitchen, which had apparently been ignored in favor of maintaining social pretenses. An older man who appeared to be related to Marlene stood up slowly. "What exactly are you saying about credit cards?" he asked. His tone was serious and concerned rather than defensive, suggesting that he understood the legal implications of what I was describing. "Sir, I'm saying that your relative has committed identity theft and fraud. I have documentation from my attorney, and I'll be pressing charges after the holiday weekend." The impact of this statement on Marlene's family gathering was immediate and devastating. People began talking quietly to each other, looking at Marlene with expressions that ranged from disappointment to disgust. Several relatives gathered their belongings and started moving toward the door. The festive atmosphere evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of awkward tension that accompanies public humiliation. Marlene tried desperately to regain control of the situation. "Everyone, please stay. Susanna is obviously having some kind of breakdown. She's been acting strange all week, and now she's making up lies to get attention. Please don't let her ruin our family Christmas." Her strategy was predictable but ineffective. When confronted with evidence of wrongdoing, blame the accuser and claim mental instability. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder Patricia had prepared for me. I have copies of the unauthorized credit applications, the cash advance receipts, and the loan application that listed my property as collateral, without my knowledge or consent. Anyone who would like to examine the documentation is welcome to do so. Several people approached me immediately, including the older man who had asked the initial question. As Marlene's relatives reviewed the evidence, their body language and facial expressions told the story I didn't need to verbalize. They could see her signature on applications that used my personal information. They could read the dates and amounts that proved systematic financial deception. They could understand the legal implications without requiring explanation from me. Within 30 minutes, more than half of Marlene's 25 relatives had left the house. Those who remained were primarily trying to understand how they had been deceived and whether they were somehow complicit in her fraudulent activities. The Christmas celebration had transformed into an impromptu family intervention with Marlene as the subject rather than the host. Renato arrived home from his Christmas Eve shift at the hospital to find his house full of strangers, examining legal documents while his wife sat crying at the kitchen table. He surveyed the scene with the kind of confused panic that accompanies arriving at a crime scene where your family members are the primary suspects. "Mom, what's happening here? Why are there so many people? And why does everyone look so upset?" I handed him a copy of the same documents his wife's relatives had been reviewing. "Son, I discovered that your wife has been using my identity to obtain credit she never qualified for independently. She's stolen over $12,000 using fraudulent applications, and she attempted to use my property as loan collateral without my knowledge. Patricia is filing criminal charges on Monday morning." Renato's reaction was exactly what I had expected from 5 years of watching him avoid difficult conversations. "Mom, surely this is all some kind of misunderstanding. Marlene would never do anything illegal. Maybe there's a simple explanation." His impulse was to minimize the problem rather than examine the evidence, which had been his response to every instance of his wife's problematic behavior. "Read the documents, Renato. Look at the signatures, the dates, the amounts. Then explain to me what kind of misunderstanding results in $12,000 of unauthorized debt in my name." I handed him the folder and waited while he examined the contents. His expression shifted gradually from skepticism to shock to something approaching nausea as he realized the extent of his wife's deception. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most damaging to their relationship. Patricia had discovered text messages between Marlene and her friend Sandra, discussing strategies for manipulating Renato and eventually gaining access to his inheritance from me. The messages revealed that Marlene had been planning to sell my house and move to California, using the proceeds to fund her online business venture. One message was particularly revealing. Renato is so naive about money. He has no idea what the house is actually worth. Once the old lady is gone, we'll have enough to start over somewhere better. He'll do whatever I suggest as long as I frame it as being good for our future. The casual cruelty of referring to me as the old lady was matched only by her calculated manipulation of my son's trust and inheritance expectations. Renato read these messages while standing in a living room full of his wife's relatives, many of whom were now staring at him with expressions of pity and concern. The humiliation of discovering his wife's true feelings about him and his family in such a public setting was exactly the kind of consequence that makes abstract betrayal feel concretely real. "Marlene," he said quietly, "is this really how you think about my mother and our marriage?" His voice was barely audible, but the question carried clearly through the now quiet house. Marlene's response would determine whether their relationship had any foundation worth preserving. "Renato, those messages are private conversations taken out of context. Sandra was having problems with her own in-laws, and I was just venting to help her feel better. You know I would never actually do anything to hurt your mother or our family." Her explanation was technically possible, but emotionally unconvincing given the financial evidence that supported her stated intentions. At that moment, Patricia Wells arrived at the house carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggests legal proceedings are about to commence. She had timed her arrival perfectly to maximize the impact of the formal measures we had prepared. The presence of 25 witnesses would make it impossible for Marlene to later claim she hadn't been properly notified of the legal consequences of her actions. "Good evening, everyone," Patricia said to the room. "I'm Patricia Wells, Mrs. Rivera's attorney. I need to serve some legal documents and explain the immediate changes that will be taking effect regarding this property and Mrs. Rivera's financial accounts." She opened her briefcase and removed several official-looking documents that she placed on the coffee table where everyone could see them. First, Mrs. Rivera's will has been updated to establish a trust that protects this property from any claims or encumbrances that might be attempted by family members. Second, all of Mrs. Rivera's financial accounts have been secured against unauthorized access. Third, the locks on this house will be changed Monday morning, and new access will be granted only to individuals who sign a formal household agreement that outlines their responsibilities and contributions. The legal terminology was complex, but the practical implications were clear. Marlene's ability to exploit my resources or manipulate my property was ending immediately. More importantly, her residence in my house was now conditional on her agreement to terms that I would establish rather than expectations she could impose. Patricia continued with the most serious element of her presentation. "Finally, criminal charges for identity theft, fraud, and attempted larceny will be filed Monday morning unless full restitution is made by Sunday evening, and a formal apology is provided to Mrs. Rivera in the presence of witnesses." The room was completely silent as the legal consequences became clear. Marlene's remaining relatives began gathering their belongings and moving toward the door with expressions that suggested they wanted no association with whatever legal drama was about to unfold. The elegant family celebration she had envisioned had become a public exposure of criminal behavior that would follow her for years to come. As the house emptied, leaving only Renato, Marlene, Patricia, and me, the real conversation could finally begin. For 5 years, important family discussions had been avoided, postponed, or manipulated by Marlene's emotional theatrics. Now, with legal documentation and criminal charges pending, the truth would have to be addressed directly and honestly. "Marlene," I said, when the front door finally closed behind the last relative, "you have 24 hours to make a decision about your future. You can provide full financial restitution, sign a formal household agreement that establishes respectful boundaries, and begin rebuilding trust through consistent, responsible behavior. Or you can face criminal prosecution and find alternative housing arrangements." Her response would determine whether this Christmas marked the beginning of a healthier family dynamic or the end of her relationship with both Renato and me. Either outcome would be better than continuing the exploitative pattern that had defined the past 5 years. Renato sat down heavily in his father's old chair and put his head in his hands. "Mom, I had no idea things had gotten this bad. I thought Marlene was just enthusiastic about family gatherings. I didn't realize she was taking advantage of you financially or taking credit for your work." His admission was both validating and frustrating. The signs had been obvious for anyone willing to examine them honestly. "Son," I replied, "the problem wasn't just that you didn't know. The problem was that you didn't want to know. Every time I tried to discuss my concerns about Marlene's behavior, you dismissed my feelings as oversensitivity. You chose to protect your wife's comfort rather than examine whether her comfort was coming at my expense." This conversation was long overdue, but it was also necessary for any possibility of moving forward constructively. Renato needed to understand his role in creating conditions that allowed Marlene's exploitation to continue unchallenged. His willful blindness had been as damaging as her deliberate manipulation. Marlene finally stopped crying and looked directly at me. Susanna, I'm sorry about the credit cards. I was planning to pay everything back before you found out. The online business was supposed to generate enough income to cover all the expenses. I never meant for this to become such a big problem. Her apology focused on getting caught rather than on the underlying betrayal, which suggested her remorse was strategic rather than genuine. Marlene, the credit cards are just one symptom of a larger pattern. For 5 years, you have treated me like unpaid household staff while positioning yourself as the gracious hostess. You have spent my money, used my belongings, and taken credit for my work without offering recognition or appreciation. The financial fraud is serious, but the emotional exploitation has been equally damaging. I was finally able to articulate the full scope of what I had experienced without being interrupted, contradicted, or dismissed. Having legal leverage made it possible to insist on being heard completely before anyone attempted to minimize or reframe my concerns. Patricia interjected with practical next steps. The restitution needs to include not only the $12,000 in fraudulent charges, but also compensation for the household expenses Mrs. Rivera has been covering without reimbursement. According to her receipts, that's an additional $15,000 over the past 2 years. The financial scope of Marlene's exploitation was even larger than I had calculated independently. $27,000, Renato asked, his voice reflecting shock at the magnitude of what his wife had cost our family. Marlene, where did all that money go? What did you buy that was worth $27,000? His question suggested he was beginning to understand that their lifestyle had been subsidized by resources he hadn't known existed. Marlene's answer revealed the extent of her financial irresponsibility. Some of it went to clothes and jewelry for family events. Some went to my business planning expenses. Some went to gifts for my relatives and friends. I thought Susanna had more money than she needed, so I didn't think it was hurting anyone. Her casual attitude toward stealing my money was perhaps more infuriating than the theft itself. Marlene, I said, what I have or don't have financially is irrelevant to whether you have the right to take it without permission. Theft is theft regardless of the victim's net worth. More importantly, you've been systematically undermining my dignity while spending money you stole from me to enhance your own reputation. The absurdity of the situation was finally becoming clear to everyone in the room. Marlene had been using my resources to create a lifestyle she couldn't afford, then treating me poorly while living in my house and spending my money. The psychological dynamics were as disturbing as the financial crimes. Patricia outlined the terms of the household agreement that would be required if Marlene wanted to continue living in my house. Mrs. Rivera will have complete authority over all household decisions, including guest lists, meal planning, and use of her personal belongings. Any family entertaining will require her explicit approval and will be funded entirely by the people organizing the events. Mrs. Rivera's financial contributions to household expenses will be voluntary rather than assumed, and she will receive full credit for any work she chooses to contribute. The agreement essentially restored my position as the owner and primary decision-maker in my own home, while establishing Marlene's role as a guest whose continued welcome depended on respectful behavior. This was exactly the boundary structure I should have implemented 5 years earlier. Additionally, Patricia continued, any future financial transactions involving Mrs. Rivera's credit, property, or accounts will require her written consent. Consent and will be documented by this office. Unauthorized use of her financial identity will result in immediate criminal prosecution without the opportunity for restitution or negotiation. The legal framework Patricia had created eliminated Marlon's ability to exploit my resources while providing clear consequences for future violations. More importantly, it established my autonomy as non-negotiable rather than subject to family pressure or emotional manipulation. Marlene looked at Renato with an expression that clearly expected him to object to these terms on her behalf. Renato, this is unreasonable. She's treating me like a criminal instead of family. I made some mistakes, but I don't deserve to be humiliated like this. Her appeal to him was a final attempt to restore the dynamic that had protected her from accountability for 5 years. Renato's response would determine whether he was willing to prioritize justice and respect over conflict avoidance and his wife's comfort. Marlon, you did commit crimes. You stole money from my mother and lied to both of us about what you were doing. These consequences aren't humiliation, they're accountability. His support for appropriate boundaries was the first sign that our family dynamic might be repairable. For 5 years, he had chosen to enable his wife's exploitation rather than confront her problematic behavior. His willingness to acknowledge reality and support fair consequences suggested growth was possible. I need until Sunday evening to find the money for restitution, Marlene said finally. Some of it I can get from returning things I bought. Some I'll have to borrow from my family, but I can make this right financially. Her focus remained primarily on avoiding criminal charges rather than on repairing relationships, but financial restitution was a necessary first step. Marlene, I replied, the money is important, but it's not sufficient. I also need a genuine apology that acknowledges the full scope of what you've done wrong, and I need consistent behavioral changes that demonstrate respect for my autonomy and contributions. This isn't just about paying a debt. It's about fundamentally changing how you treat me. The conversation concluded with clear expectations and defined consequences. Marlene had 24 hours to provide full financial restitution and a comprehensive apology. If she met these requirements, she could sign the household agreement and attempt to rebuild trust through respectful behavior. If she didn't meet these requirements, she would face criminal charges and eviction. On Christmas morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in 5 days. The house was quiet and clean, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined the previous evening's failed family gathering. Marlene and Renato were presumably dealing with the financial and logistical challenges of meeting my deadline, but their crisis was no longer my responsibility to resolve. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table reviewing the documents Patricia had prepared. The trust agreement, the household contract, the criminal complaint that would be filed if restitution wasn't provided. For the first time in years, I held documents that protected my interests rather than obligated me to serve other people's needs. At noon, Marlene knocked on my bedroom door carrying an envelope and wearing an expression that combined nervousness with what might have been genuine remorse. Susanna, I have the money for restitution, and I've written an apology letter. Can we talk about moving forward? Her tone was more respectful than I had heard from her in 5 years. The envelope contained $27,000 in cashier's checks, along with a 2-page letter that addressed each aspect of her exploitative behavior. She acknowledged taking credit for my cooking and hosting work. She apologized for treating me like hired help rather than family. She admitted that the financial theft was inexcusable, regardless of her intentions. Most importantly, she committed to behavioral changes that would demonstrate ongoing respect for my autonomy. The apology was more comprehensive than I had expected, but apologies are only meaningful when followed by consistent behavioral changes. Marlene, I accept your apology and your restitution. Whether I continue to accept your presence in my home will depend on how well you follow through on these commitments over the coming months. That afternoon, we signed the household agreement in Patricia's office with Renato serving as a witness. The document formalized everything that should have been understood from the beginning. My house, my rules, my decisions. Marlene's residence was now explicitly conditional on respectful behavior and proportional contributions. On Christmas evening, I prepared a small dinner for the three of us using ingredients I had purchased with the restituted money. It was the first family meal in 5 years where I received full credit for the cooking and where Marlene served the food instead of being served by me. The dynamic shift was subtle but profound. "Susanna," Marlene said as we finished dessert, "thank you for giving me a chance to make this right instead of just pressing charges immediately. I understand now that I was taking advantage of your generosity, and I'm committed to being a better daughter-in-law and family member." Her words felt more genuine than her previous apologies. The evening ended with clear boundaries firmly established and appropriate consequences successfully implemented. Marlene had learned that exploiting my resources would result in legal prosecution. Renato had learned that enabling disrespectful behavior toward his mother was no longer acceptable. I had learned that protecting my dignity was more important than maintaining false peace. This Christmas had marked the end of my 5-year period of voluntary servitude and the beginning of a new phase based on mutual respect and fair exchange. My house remained my house. My resources remained under my control, and my contributions would be recognized and appreciated rather than assumed and exploited. The transformation was complete, the boundaries were established, and the consequences were clear. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to future family gatherings where I would be treated as an honored family member rather than unpaid household staff. The education had been expensive, but the results were worth every difficult conversation and legal document required to achieve them.